A broke young artist teaches a silent boy to paint until a mysterious billionaire shows up at the window and changes everything. F course. Here is Chapter 1, written in very detailed and expanded English, as requested, self-contained, not mixed with other chapters. The peeling paint on the old brick building made it look forgotten by time, a skeleton of what might have once been a proud gallery. A rusted sign hung over the doorway, its faded letters reading, "The Canvas Room." No one came there for prestige or profit, only for hope. And it was in this small corner of the city, at the edge of decay and resilience, that 26-year-old Elora Maeve poured her soul into her brush, and into the hearts of children no one else wanted to see. Elora wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. In fact, she barely made enough to cover food for the week. Her bed was a fold-out cot tucked behind a curtain in the back room. The gallery smelled faintly of oil paint, rainwater, and something deeper, like old dreams. But none of that mattered when the kids walked in. For them, she smiled. For them, she gave every lesson her aching hands could offer. She had no formal teaching degree, but her passion and pain made her unforgettable. The children she taught weren't from cozy homes. They came from the streets, from broken families, from shelters. Many had seen too much for their age. Elora knew how that felt. She was a foster kid herself, bounced between strangers and silence. Maybe that's why she understood them without words. That gray Wednesday morning started like most others. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the cold wind whispered through the broken window panes. Elora wrapped a paint-stained shawl over her shoulders and lit the space heater with a flick of a match. At exactly 9:03, the bell on the door chimed, thin and weak. A tall woman in a long navy coat stepped in, holding the hand of a small boy. She didn't introduce herself, just looked around nervously and muttered, "He's here for the morning class." The woman didn't make eye contact, didn't wait for a reply. She simply turned and left, her heels clicking across the sidewalk like punctuation marks in a goodbye. The boy didn't move at first. He stood near the door, his gaze locked on the floor. He looked to be around 8, small, with dark, messy hair and eyes so big they seemed to swallow the light. He wore a red hoodie 2 sizes too big and clutched a rolled-up piece of paper in his hand. Elora knelt slowly and offered a gentle smile. Hey there, I'm Elora," she said softly. "Do you want to come see what we're painting today?" He didn't answer, just stared. Then, after a long moment, he walked toward her without a word and sat down at an easel. She watched him cautiously, sensing something unusual. Not fear, but weight. A quiet that wasn't shy, but heavy. She handed him a blank sheet of thick paper, a brush, and a small palette of colors. Most kids chose blue skies, flowers, houses, cartoon characters, but not him. Within minutes, he began to paint. Elora stood back, arms crossed, lips parting in disbelief. What the boy created wasn't childish. He painted a forest, twisted, dark, and hauntingly detailed. Tall, barren trees with broken branches, a single bird flying away. And in the middle of it all, a small figure crouched beside a hollow tree stump, alone. It was aching. She moved closer, crouching beside him. "That's really beautiful. What's your name?" He glanced up at her, his eyes flickering with something distant. "Finch." Elora blinked. "Like the bird?" He nodded, then turned back to the painting. "Now, did someone teach you to paint like this?" Finch shook his head. "No, it's just stuff I see in my head." She was quiet, letting the moment hang. There was no need to prod. The art said more than words ever could. Still, something in her chest ached. This boy was different. Not just talented, wounded. The other kids had started their own messy masterpieces, chatting and smearing color everywhere. But Finch stayed locked in silence, focused, intentional. His little fingers moved with precision, far beyond his years. When the class ended, the same woman returned, pulling Finch by the hand without a word. But just before the door closed, the boy looked back. And in that fleeting second, Elora saw it. A flicker. Not just sadness. Recognition. Like he'd found something he didn't know he was missing. She stood in the quiet room long after the children had left, staring at Finch's abandoned painting. And for the first time in months, she felt something she couldn't explain. The feeling that her life had just shifted, only slightly, but enough that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, the rain hadn't let up. It drizzled steadily against the gallery windows, like soft static. the sky a thick blanket of gray. Elora arrived early, wrapped in her oversized coat, her breath visible in the cold air of the still waking space. She turned on the heater, lit a small candle near the front window, and prepared the day's paints. Her mind wasn't on the lesson plan, though. It was on Finch. Something about that boy had burrowed into her, like a haunting song you can't forget. His silence, his eyes, the aching detail in that painting, and that flicker in his gaze when he looked back at her. It wasn't something a child should carry. It was the kind of look you see in someone who's lived through something too big, too cruel. She replayed his name in her head over and over. Finch. Like the small, fragile bird he painted, taking flight from a forest of shadows. By 9:10 a.m., the room began to fill with the usual group of children, chattering, laughing, full of chaotic energy. But there was no sign of Finch. Elora kept glancing toward the door with every jingle of the bell, but each time it was just another child or a parent. The red hoodie, the dark hair, none of it appeared. She tried to focus, guiding the kids through a lesson on warm and cool colors, helping one little girl mix the perfect shade of lavender. Still, her eyes returned again and again to the empty easel in the corner. Finch's seat remained untouched, and his painting from the day before was still where he had left it, the haunting image of the lonely forest staring back at her. Then, just as the class was winding down and parents were beginning to gather their children, Elora caught something from the corner of her eye. Movement outside. A figure, tall, lean, sharply dressed in a dark coat, was standing across the street, half concealed by the overhanging branches of a bare tree. He was looking directly at the gallery. She froze mid-step. The man wasn't moving, wasn't checking a phone or smoking a cigarette. He was simply watching. His stance was too deliberate, too still to be casual. Elora squinted, trying to make out his features through the rain-streaked glass. His face was partially shadowed by the hood of his coat, but his presence was unmistakable. There was something intensely controlled about him, like someone who was always calculating. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Even through the glass, the connection sent a chill down her spine. She turned to check the room. Most of the kids had gone. When she looked back outside, the man was gone. Later that evening, as the wind howled against the building and the last child was picked up, Elora moved to clean the brushes and lock up. She couldn't stop thinking about that man. Who was he? Why was he watching? She was wiping the tables when the front door creaked open once again. Standing there, tall, composed, with water glistening on the shoulders of his wool coat, was the same man. He stepped inside with a certain precision, like someone used to commanding rooms much larger and grander than this one. "Miss Maeve?" His voice was low and smooth, but not warm. It had a quiet authority to it. She tensed instinctively. "Yes? I'm Nolan Vexler," he said simply, and Elora's heart did a somersault in her chest. That name. She had heard it before. Somewhere in a news article, maybe. Something about an empire of media, high-stake business deals. A man who never gave interviews and was always described with words like ruthless and brilliant. "You taught my son yesterday," he added. Finch! Now it clicked. The resemblance, the eyes. She hadn't connected it before, but now that he stood here in front of her, it was unmistakable. Same deep-set eyes, same quiet intensity. "I wasn't aware his father would visit," she said carefully. "I didn't intend to at first," he replied, "but Finch has never taken to anyone. Not since—" His jaw tightened for the briefest moment. "Since his mother." Elora's tone softened. "He's an extraordinary child. He sees the world differently." Nolan nodded, glancing around the room. His gaze paused on the painting Finch had left behind. He stepped toward it without asking. When his eyes landed on the image, on the lonely forest, the child under the dead tree, and the single bird escaping upward, something in his expression faltered. For just a second, his composure cracked. Elora caught it. A flicker of pain, regret, or maybe recognition. "He drew this in under an hour," she said, standing beside him. "Did he ever take lessons?" "No," Nolan replied, eyes still on the canvas. "But his mother was an artist, a brilliant one. She didn't survive the pressure of my world." Elora stayed silent. The weight of his words filled the space between them. "I watched from across the street this morning," he admitted. "I wasn't sure whether I wanted to come in. But Finch came home yesterday, and for the first time in months, he talked. Not much, but enough. He said he liked the lady with the red scarf, that you didn't talk down to him. Elora folded her arms. I don't think children should be talked down to, especially not ones with souls that deep. Nolan finally turned to face her directly. I'd like him to continue with your lessons, but I'd prefer if it were private, here or at our home. Elora hesitated. I don't charge for my classes. These are free for families who can't afford formal art school. He raised an eyebrow. That won't be a problem. That's not what I meant. A pause. For a moment, Nolan studied her, as if recalibrating everything he thought about this place, this woman and this strange, quiet story unfolding between them. Then, quietly, he said, he needs someone who sees him, not someone who manages him. I don't know how to be that person. Elora's voice was softer now. Maybe you don't have to be perfect, just present. He looked away as if the idea itself was heavier than it should be. Then, with a slight nod, he turned toward the door. Before leaving, he added, tomorrow, 10 a.m., he'll be back. As the door closed behind him, Elora stood still in the dim room, the candle flickering beside Finch's painting. She didn't know what just began between her and the man who carried storms in his silence. But something was shifting. Something deep. Something real. The following morning dawned with a strange golden haze hanging over the city, as if the sun itself had paused in thought. Elora arrived at the gallery earlier than usual, driven by an unexplainable restlessness. She had barely slept. Her mind kept looping over the encounter with Nolan Wexler, the billionaire in the shadows, the father of the quiet boy who had stirred something in her that went beyond art or duty. She brewed a weak cup of coffee and stood by the tall front windows, watching the city stretch awake. For a moment, she caught her reflection in the glass, paint-stained sweater, curls pulled back in a haphazard knot, and eyes tired but alert. Something inside her knew that the rhythm of her life had shifted. Whether for good or bad, she couldn't yet tell. At precisely 10 a.m., the door chimed. There he was. Finch walked in alone, clutching a worn leather sketchbook against his chest. Behind him, Nolan lingered just outside the door, dressed in tailored gray, speaking into a Bluetooth earpiece. He didn't enter, but their eyes met briefly through the glass. He gave her the smallest nod, then turned and walked toward a waiting black town car at the curb. Elora turned her full attention to the boy. Morning, Finch, she said gently. He didn't respond with words, but his eyes lit up ever so slightly. He walked over to the same easel from 2 days ago, as if it belonged to him now, and opened the sketchbook. Elora sat nearby without pressing, giving him space. He flipped to a half-finished drawing of what looked like a woman kneeling beside a tree with a bird in her hand. It was rough but expressive. What caught her attention most, however, was that the woman looked vaguely familiar. She glanced at the painting on the wall, the one he'd done before, and noticed a resemblance. Is this me? She asked softly, nodding toward the sketch. Finch hesitated, then gave the faintest shrug, but his fingers curled tighter around the pencil. Elora felt a strange lump form in her throat. It's beautiful, she said. They worked in a peaceful rhythm for the next hour. Elora didn't need to guide him much. Finch knew what he wanted to draw. She simply mirrored him, painting her own quiet forest on a canvas nearby, every so often glancing over to catch the slight furrow in his brow or the calm in his posture. But just as she was mixing a shade of warm ochre, Finch suddenly stopped. His hand trembled. He looked toward the front window. Following his gaze, Elora saw it too. A shadow. A tall figure standing across the street again. But this time, it wasn't Nolan. It was a woman. She was blonde, dressed in a fitted beige coat and high heels that didn't belong on cracked sidewalks. Her sunglasses obscured her eyes, but her stance was unmistakably predatory. She wasn't watching the gallery. She was watching Finch. Finch's entire body seemed to shrink. His shoulders curved inward, and his breathing grew uneven. Finch? Elora said, moving gently closer. Do you know her? He nodded, barely. Is she family? Another nod, but something about his reaction screamed fear. Elora stepped protectively between him and the window, just as the woman turned and disappeared down the street. She knelt down beside him. You're safe here, okay? I promise. Finch didn't respond, but he blinked hard, as if pushing back something. A memory? A tear? After a few moments, he picked up his pencil again. But this time, what emerged on the page was not a forest or a tree. It was a woman's face. Harsh lines, cold expression, and in her hand, a leash. At the end of it, a bird with a broken wing. Elora stared at the drawing, breath caught in her throat. No words could touch that kind of pain. Later that day, after Finch had been picked up by the same silent driver in the same polished car, Elora couldn't let the image go. She sat alone in the gallery, the wind rattling the old windows, and pulled out her phone. She searched the name Nolan Vexler. The screen flooded with links: CEO, tech visionary, billionaire philanthropist. Photos of him at charity galas, in clean suits beside polished wives. One headline caught her eye: Vexler family divorce, finalized after controversial custody battle. Another said, tragedy strikes media mogul, ex-wife Annalise Vexler found dead in Manhattan condo. Elora's breath hitched. So, Finch's mother was gone. But then, who was the woman today? A relative? A ghost of the past? She clicked further. In one article, a name, Sybil Vexler, Nolan's sister, a former child psychologist turned corporate consultant. There was a photo. Sharp cheekbones, impeccable hair, empty eyes. It was her. The woman from the street. Elora leaned back slowly, the old wooden chair creaking beneath her. This wasn't just about painting anymore. This wasn't even just about a lonely boy and his wealthy, distant father. There were shadows in that family, ones that reached deep into Finch's silence. And somehow, Elora had stepped into the center of them. She knew then. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Not from him. Elora barely slept that night. The image of Finch's latest drawing, the cold-faced woman holding a leash with a wounded bird, was etched in her mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. She lay in her narrow cot behind the gallery's back curtain, wrapped in a blanket of silence and fear. Not fear for herself, but for him. For the boy who painted pain like he had lived 100 lifetimes. By morning, her decision was made. She would visit him, not as a teacher, as someone who saw him, who heard him, who refused to look away. By 10, she stood nervously outside the wrought iron gates of the Vexler estate. It was a mansion tucked into the edge of the city, surrounded by tall hedges and guarded by sleek black security cameras. The driver, same man who had picked Finch up from the gallery, had arrived early to take her here after a brief call from Nolan. She'd half expected the offer to vanish after what happened yesterday, but it hadn't. She pressed her palm against the smooth leather strap of her satchel, filled with paint supplies, and exhaled deeply as the gates swung open. The house looked like something out of an architecture magazine. Glass and stone, vast and cold, a sharp contrast to the color and mess of her gallery. A place of silence, of wealth, of control. The door opened before she could knock. Nolan Vexler stood there, wearing a black sweater over dark slacks. No blazer today. No tie. He looked less like a mogul and more like a man who hadn't yet decided who he was. Elora, he said simply, stepping aside to let her in. She crossed the threshold, instantly struck by the vastness of the space. The foyer was bathed in natural light from a skylight above, but the warmth was missing. It felt like walking into a museum. He's in the sunroom, Nolan said, already walking ahead. He's been waiting. The phrase made her heart tighten. Finch sat on a window bench, knees tucked to his chest, gazing out at the sprawling garden beyond the glass. When he saw her, his eyes lit up. Not in a bright explosion, but in a quiet bloom, like a flower unfolding in slow motion. Elora, he whispered, as if he wasn't sure she was real. She knelt beside him without hesitation. Hi, Finch. Brought some colors. Want to paint? He didn't answer with words. He reached out and gently took her hand. Nolan stood back, watching the scene, his face unreadable. For the next hour, Elora and Finch sat on the floor with sketchbooks and paints spread around them. The cold marble beneath them didn't matter. Finch worked with a focus that seemed to ease his breathing, his muscles relaxing as he painted a series of images. A small house, a woman under a tree, a red bird soaring above the clouds. But, as the afternoon wore on, the door behind them opened sharply. Footsteps, high heels, click, click, click. Elora didn't even have to turn around. She knew who it was. Sybil, Nolan said coolly, his tone tightening. I see the rumors are true, the woman replied crisply. You've brought in a street artist to play therapist. Elora stood slowly, turning to face the tall, composed woman she had seen outside the gallery. Sybil Vexler looked exactly as she had before, polished, powerful, cold. "I'm just here to help Finch express himself," Alora said calmly. "Oh, I'm sure," Sybil replied, voice dripping with condescension. "But expression isn't healing, dear. It's indulgence. The boy needs real treatment. Structure. Boundaries. Not finger painting with failed bohemians." Finch froze behind Alora, his brush midair. "He's not broken," Alora said firmly. "He doesn't need to be controlled. He needs to be heard." Sybil stepped closer. "You're overstepping." Nolan finally moved between them, his voice quiet but razor-edged. "That's enough, Sybil. You're not his guardian. You never were." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Mother would have been appalled. "Mother isn't here." The silence that followed was thunderous. Then, without another word, Sybil turned and walked away, heels echoing down the hallway. Nolan stood still for a moment, then ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "I'm sorry you had to see that." Alora glanced back at Finch. His eyes were wide, but not surprised. She knelt beside him again and placed a hand over his. "Do you want to keep painting, Finch?" she asked. But he just whispered, "Please don't go." Her heart nearly broke in half. She looked up at Nolan. "I need a favor," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He nodded. "Let me stay with him a while longer. No interruptions, no pressure. Just me and him. I want to try something." He looked at her for a long time, then said, "All right." With that, he left the room and closed the door behind him. Alora pulled out a new canvas and set it before Finch. "I want you to paint what freedom feels like," she said. He stared at her. "I don't know what that means." "That's okay," she replied softly. "I just paint what your heart wants most." He hesitated and then began. The first stroke was blue, then yellow, then orange. No black, no trees, only sky, only light. She didn't speak again, just watched. And when he finally looked up at her with eyes wide and glistening, she understood. He had never been allowed to dream before. But now, maybe, he would. Alora woke up the next morning with a strange mixture of lightness and dread in her chest. The image of Finch's final painting from the day before lingered in her mind like the scent of warm rain on dry pavement. Vivid, beautiful, and fragile. It had been a breakthrough, and she knew it. The colors he'd chosen, the absence of darkness, the sudden sky. That painting wasn't just a picture. It was a confession. A whisper of hope. But hope was delicate. And in a house like the Vexler estate, where everything was built of steel, glass, and control, she knew delicate things didn't survive for long. Still, she returned. She stepped out of the town car, clutching her art supplies, her heart beating steadily as she passed through the wrought iron gates once more. The air felt different today, heavier, tense, as if the house itself sensed something was coming. The front door opened before she knocked. It wasn't Nolan. It was a woman in a navy suit. Cold smile, sharp clipboard. "Elora Maeve?" she asked flatly. Elora hesitated. "Yes?" "I'm here on behalf of the Vexler Family Trust. I'm afraid your presence here is no longer authorized." The words hit like ice water. I, I don't understand," Elora stammered. "I was invited by Mr. Vexler." The woman didn't blink. "This is a private matter. You're trespassing now. Please leave immediately." Before Elora could answer, she heard the shuffle of small feet behind the woman. "Wait!" Finch's voice cried out from the hallway. He darted forward, clutching a piece of paper, his face red and eyes wide with panic. "Don't make her leave!" The woman turned and tried to gently restrain him, but he slipped past, running straight into Elora's arms. "I told them I want you here," he sobbed into her shirt. "I told them." Elora clutched him tightly, heart pounding. She looked up, past the woman, to see Nolan standing at the top of the stairs. He wasn't dressed in his usual calm. Today he looked stormy, disheveled. Something had happened. He descended slowly. "Sybil called the board," he said bitterly. "Claimed you were manipulating my son for personal gain. She filed a motion to reassess custody arrangements. Threatened to involve child services." Elora's throat closed. "She wants to remove him from your custody?" Nolan nodded, jaw clenched. "She's using every legal tool she can get her hands on, all under the guise of protecting the family legacy. She doesn't care about Finch, she never did. But to her, he's a pawn, a future heir, and He trailed off, looking at Finch. "I gave her the weapons. Years ago." Finch gripped Elora tighter. "I won't go with her," he whispered. I'll run away if I have to. Alora crouched down, brushing the hair gently from his face. You won't have to run, sweetheart. I won't let that happen. But inside, she wasn't sure how she could stop it. That evening, she returned to the gallery. Alone. The silence in the space felt heavier than ever. She lit a candle and sat at the corner table, Finch's drawing still clutched in her hand. It was a sketch of the two of them, Alora holding a giant paintbrush like a sword, standing between Finch and a faceless woman looming behind him. She stared at it for a long time. Then, she made a decision. If the Vexlers wanted to fight with power and money, she had only one weapon: truth. The next morning, she visited the media office downtown, one of the smaller subsidiaries of the Vexler Empire. She walked in holding an envelope. Inside it, photographs of Finch's artwork, notes from her sessions with him, a letter she had written herself. This is not a story about money, she had written. It's a story about a boy who was drowning in silence and found a voice through paint. If you take away his colors, you take away his breath. At first, no one returned her calls, but then something happened. 3 days later, an article appeared on a local digital news site. Inside the silent world of Finch Vexler, art, grief, and the woman who helped him speak. It wasn't clickbait. It wasn't scandal. It was raw, honest, painful, beautiful. The story spread quietly at first, but then caught fire. Readers were moved by the idea that beneath the Vexler name was a little boy who painted trees and birds, a boy who found peace with a paintbrush and a kind woman with red-stained hands. Emails flooded in, teachers, psychologists, artists, people offering to help. And one email came from Nolan, just 2 words: thank you. That night, Alora sat in the gallery alone again, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from the strange ache of fighting for someone else's child, as if he were your own. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: power. Not the kind with money, the kind that comes from doing the right thing even when your voice trembles. And somewhere in the distance, a little boy was painting again, this time with hope. The storm broke just after midnight. Not a literal one, though the sky outside Alora's gallery had been clouding all day, but the kind of storm that unravels carefully constructed lives, brick by brick. Alora was in the back room, lying on her cot, when her phone began to buzz relentlessly. At first, she ignored it, but the name on the screen made her sit up so fast, her blanket fell to the floor. Nolan Vexler. She answered breathlessly. Hello? Alora, he said, voice tight. I need your help. Those words, coming from a man who had always spoken in composed, measured tones, hit like a punch. What happened? She asked. She took him. Her stomach dropped. Who? Sybil. She filed an emergency petition. The board signed off without consulting me. Said I was unfit, emotionally compromised. She told them I was romantically involved with you, and that it blurred ethical boundaries. Elora's heart pounded. That's not true. I know, Nolan replied, but perception is power in this family. They came this evening while I was out finalizing legal paperwork. Said it was for a temporary evaluation. He didn't even get to pack. They just took him. A silence filled the line. Alora could almost feel the rage vibrating through it. He's terrified of her, Nolan, she whispered. You know what she's capable of. I do, he said, and then quietly, I never thought she'd go this far. Alora was already pulling on a sweater, grabbing her satchel. Where is she keeping him? Upstate, the Vexler Retreat House in Terry Hill. It's a gated property, old summer home. She thinks no one will dare challenge her there. Does she know about the article? She does now. That's why she acted so fast. She's scared. And when Sybil is scared, she gets violent with words. With control. Alora didn't hesitate. Send me the address. Alora. Send it, Nolan. When the car pulled up in front of the estate, nearly 2 hours later, the fog was thick and moonlight barely touched the ancient iron gates that guarded the property like a curse. The mansion ahead was not modern like Nolan's main residence. This one was old money Gothic, stone, vines, and shadows. The kind of place that seemed to exhale secrets through its very walls. Alora stepped out of the car, her shoes crunching on the gravel. She didn't look back. A guard approached the gate. Private property. You're not authorized. I'm here for Finch Vexler, she said clearly, holding up a folder of documents, the ones she'd prepared just in case. And I have the media, legal, and psychological backing of 3 institutions willing to go public if anything happens to him." The man hesitated. There was doubt in his eyes. He reached for a walkie-talkie but paused. He recognized something in her expression, something immovable. "I'll let them know you're here," he said gruffly, and disappeared through the gate. Alora stood in the cold for nearly 20 minutes before the door creaked open and a figure appeared in the grand entrance. Sybil. She descended the steps like a queen interrupted mid-throne. She wore silk, her expression stone, her words sharpened to cut. "You've made quite a mess, Miss Maeve." Elora didn't flinch. "Where is he?" "He's safe," Sybil replied. "As he should be. Away from men with poor judgment and women who manipulate broken children to soothe their own savior complexes." "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough. You're a woman who paints in a crumbling warehouse, who stepped far outside her role and began fantasizing about being part of something she doesn't understand." Alora stepped forward. "Finch is not a trophy, not a pawn. He's a child who draws his trauma because no one in this family listens when he speaks." "But I listened. And he begged me not to let you near him again." Sybil's eyes narrowed. "You forget who I am," she hissed. "No," Elora said softly. "I remember exactly who you are, and so does he." A sharp silence followed. Then a voice cut through it. "I want to go home." They both turned. At the top of the stairs stood Finch, pale, small, holding a red piece of chalk like a weapon. His sketchbook was clutched to his chest. "Finch," Sybil started. "I hate this place," he said. "You locked the paints. You said I was overstimulated. You made me sit in a dark room and write lines." Sybil's face contorted, but she said nothing. Finch descended the stairs, step by trembling step, until he reached Elora. He looked up at her. "Can I come with you?" Elora crouched and looked him in the eyes. "Yes, but only if you're sure." "I'm sure," Sybil's voice cracked. "You don't have the legal right." Nolan's voice interrupted her like thunder. "But I do." They all turned to the doorway. Nolan stood there, flanked by 2 lawyers. One held a court order. The other, a thick folder of supporting evidence. "We filed an emergency reversal," Nolan said. "Your authority's been revoked, Sybil. As of 1 hour ago, full custody is mine again." "You're making a mistake," she spat. "No," Nolan said, stepping toward her. "You did." Sybil froze, for the first time, truly silent. That night, as they drove back to the city, Finch curled up beside Elora in the back seat, his sketchbook open on his lap. He didn't draw monsters or cages this time. He drew a small house, a red scarf hanging by the door, and inside, 3 figures, a boy, a woman, and a man. He titled it simply, "Where I Want to Be." And Elora, watching him through glistening eyes, felt something crack open inside her, a space that had been closed for years, a place called family. She reached over and gently squeezed his hand. He didn't let go. The following days unfolded like the slow unfurling of dawn after a night too long. Elora returned to the gallery, but it no longer felt like the same space. It had been her sanctuary for years, quiet, cluttered, filled with the comforting chaos of color and creation. But now it carried new meaning. It had become a place of safety, not just for forgotten children, but for a little boy who had begun to believe the world could be gentle. Finch was with her almost every day now. By court order, Nolan had full custody again. But more than that, he had made a choice, a conscious, visible one. He didn't retreat into boardrooms or meetings. He didn't hide behind assistants or legal teams. He stayed. He showed up every morning to drop Finch off at the gallery. And sometimes, less guarded, more curious, he lingered. One chilly morning, Elora stepped out to find Nolan standing by the window, watching Finch draw through the glass with a strange tenderness on his face. "He hums now," Nolan said quietly. Elora smiled. "I've heard him. He never did that before. Not since Annalise." Elora's smile faded slightly at the name of Finch's mother. It was one of the few topics they hadn't broached yet, as if some memories were still too delicate to touch. Nolan continued, "She was brilliant, wild, daring, and completely unequipped for a life behind gates and dinner parties. I think she started to disappear the moment I tried to cage her into my world." Elora stayed quiet, allowing him the space to say what needed saying. "She started painting less, then drinking more," he said, voice like a man talking to a ghost. When she died, I blamed everyone else. Sybil, the pressure, the therapists, the public. And now? Elora asked gently. He looked at her. Now I blame myself. Elora studied him, really studied him. The perfect lines of his jaw, the exhaustion in his posture, the deep ache in his eyes. She had been wrong when she thought he was made of stone. Nolan Vexler was a man stitched together by guilt and survival. You can't change the past, she said, but you can change what comes next. For Finch. He nodded slowly. That's why I'm here, and why I'm not going anywhere. That day, as Finch painted a vivid landscape filled with suns and birds and rivers that curved like music, Elora caught herself watching Nolan more than she meant to. He wasn't just observing Finch anymore. He was participating, asking questions, sketching clumsily on the edge of a napkin, laughing when Finch teased him for his terrible mountains. And something in Elora's heart began to shift. That evening, Nolan offered to walk her home. The streets were lit by the soft glow of street lamps and holiday lights, strung lazily over doorways. Elora had wrapped her red scarf tightly around her neck, and the wind caught loose curls of her hair. Why do you stay in that gallery? Nolan asked as they walked. You could sell your work, have a better studio. You deserve more. She smiled faintly. I don't stay there because I have to. I stay because I want to. It saved me once, and now it's saving others. It's not about walls or windows. It's about what's created inside. Nolan glanced sideways. You make everything sound like poetry. Maybe life is supposed to be, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They stopped at the entrance to her building, an old walk-up with ivy crawling along the bricks. He didn't rush to leave. Elora, he said, voice a little rougher than before. I've been thinking about all of this. You, Finch, us. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the billionaire or the broken man, but the human being beneath it all. Raw, flawed, real. What are you thinking? She asked. I'm thinking, I want this, he said. Not just for Finch, but for me too. For us. Elora's heart skipped, stuttered, and leapt all in a single beat. Nolan. He took her hand gently. I'm not asking for anything fast. I know we come from different worlds, but every time you walk into a room, my son smiles. And for the first time in years, I do too. The wind wrapped around them, but Elora didn't feel the cold. She felt warmth blooming in her chest, a slow, cautious warmth that had taken root when a silent little boy first painted trees in her gallery. She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, stood on her toes, and kissed him gently, like an answer, a promise, and a beginning all at once. When she pulled back, she saw the quiet astonishment in his eyes, the softness, the hope. Tomorrow, she whispered, let's paint something new. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Nolan Vexler smiled like a man who believed he deserved a second chance. Spring came early that year. The city, still bruised from winter, began to thaw beneath skies painted with soft pastels. Tiny green buds pushed their way through iron fences. Cafes opened their sidewalk tables. Children laughed louder, played longer, and inside a modest art gallery on the corner of Alton and Briar, something beautiful was blooming. Elora stood by the wide front window, arms folded lightly, watching Finch paint. He sat at his usual easel, his shoulders relaxed, his mouth curled into a soft, unforced smile. He no longer drew forests of grief or cages of fear. His latest work was a sunlit field filled with flying birds, each one a different color, different shape. No two the same, yet all in the sky together. Across the room, Nolan was talking with a group of parents. The gallery had expanded, just slightly, but enough to include new weekend workshops, scholarships, and therapy through art programs. It had become a haven, not just for children, but for families, for people rebuilding. Today was the gallery's one-year anniversary since the day Finch first walked in. They hadn't made a spectacle of it. Elora didn't like spectacle, but there were cupcakes, laughter, music playing low from a vinyl speaker, and hand-painted banners made by the kids themselves. Finch's banner simply said, I found home here. That alone made Elora cry when she first saw it taped to the wall. Nolan approached her now, his sleeves rolled up, the top button of his shirt undone, something she'd come to see as his way of relaxing around her. He reached for her hand without hesitation, and she welcomed it. Did you see the board in the back? He asked, nodding toward the rear room. She shook her head. Come, he said, his voice holding that gentle conviction that never demanded. It invited. She followed him past the main space into the back area where the kids usually stored their paintings. But today, something was different. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in framed drawings, all made by Finch. At first, she couldn't speak. Some were from his earliest days, the black forest, the hidden birds, the hollow trees. Others were newer, vivid, wild with color. There was one she recognized immediately, the painting of the three of them, Finch, Nolan, and herself, standing in front of a small house with light spilling from the windows. At the center of the display was a canvas she had never seen before. It showed a woman holding a bouquet of brushes instead of flowers. Her hair was caught in the wind, and her smile glowed with something brighter than light. She stood in a field, her arms outstretched, and around her were dozens of children, all reaching, laughing, alive. At the bottom, in Finch's careful, determined handwriting, were 4 words. She gave us color. Elora pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Nolan moved beside her, his eyes warm, protective. He painted that last week, he said. I didn't show anyone. Said it was a surprise. Elora's eyes filled with tears. He's incredible. He is, Nolan agreed. But so are you. She turned toward him, her voice low. Do you ever regret it? Any of it? He shook his head immediately. Never. Not meeting you. Not letting go of the walls I'd spent my whole life building. You taught me something I didn't even know I needed to learn. She tilted her head. What's that? How to love out loud. Outside, children were laughing again, and somewhere in the crowd, Finch's voice rose, clear, joyous. That night, after the last cupcake had been eaten and the final smudge of paint had dried, Elora locked the front door of the gallery. The sun had set, and the city hummed its lullaby. Nolan was beside her, his coat slung over one shoulder. Finch had fallen asleep on a beanbag in the reading corner, curled up like a kitten, clutching a brush in one hand and a crumpled napkin drawing in the other. They didn't want to wake him just yet. Instead, Elora and Nolan sat quietly by the window, watching the glow of the street lamps paint soft halos across the glass. Remember the first day you came here? She asked. I remember thinking you were chaos in red paint, he smirked. And now? Now I think you're the reason I can breathe. She leaned her head on his shoulder. For a long time, they didn't speak. Then Elora whispered, Do you think this lasts? The peace, the happiness, the family? Nolan kissed her forehead gently. If we keep choosing it every day, he said, then yes, it lasts. She nodded, her heart full. And as the night folded around them and Finch stirred softly in sleep, the gallery stood quiet, filled with light, love, and the soft promise of forever. A place where silence had once lived, now echoed with joy. A place once built from pain, now stood strong on hope. And at its heart, always, was a little boy, a brush, and the woman who gave him color. In my view, the ending of this story is exactly what it was always meant to be. Not perfect, but earned. This wasn't a fairy tale where wounds magically disappear or where love alone fixes everything. It was a story about healing through presence, about choosing softness in a world that often rewards hardness. Elora didn't just save Finch, she saw him, and that act of seeing was radical in itself. And Nolan, once buried in silence and guilt, chose vulnerability over legacy. That, to me, is the real miracle. What makes the ending powerful is that it isn't loud, it's tender. It reminds us that sometimes the most life-changing moments happen in quiet rooms, with paint on fingers and laughter on the walls. They didn't find perfection. They found each other. And for a broken boy, a grieving man, and a woman who had spent most of her life alone in a gallery, that was everything. That was home.